What happens when one of the most powerful figures in America sits down for what should be a routine interview, only to find himself facing accusations that strike at the very heart of his credibility? The tension in the NBC studio was palpable from the moment Donald Trump settled into his chair across from Lester Holt. What started as a standard political interview quickly spiraled into one of the most explosive confrontations ever captured on live television. The exchange that followed would reveal something far more intense than anyone anticipated, and by the end, both men would be pushed to their absolute limits. Before we dive into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below telling us what you think about what you're about to witness. The studio lights were bright, almost uncomfortably so, as Lester Holt adjusted his notes one final time. Across from him, Donald Trump sat with that familiar posture, leaning back slightly, his hands folded on the armrest. The interview had been scheduled for weeks, promoted heavily by NBC as an exclusive sit-down that would cover everything from policy decisions to recent controversies. What nobody knew was that Holt had spent the previous 72 hours reviewing documents, cross-referencing statements, and preparing what he believed to be an ironclad line of questioning. He had a reputation to uphold as a journalist who didn't shy away from tough questions, and tonight he intended to prove exactly why he'd earned that reputation. Trump, for his part, seemed relaxed. He'd done hundreds of these interviews before, maybe thousands. He knew the game, knew how to deflect, how to pivot, how to turn a hostile question into an opportunity to drive home his own message. But there was something different in Holt's demeanor that evening, something that suggested this wouldn't be the typical back and forth. The anchor's jaw was set, his eyes focused with an intensity that hadn't been there in their previous encounters. Holt began with the pleasantries, the standard opening that every interview requires. He thanked Trump for joining him, mentioned the topics they'd be covering, and then, without much transition, he went straight for the jugular. His voice was steady, professional, but there was an edge to it that cut through the studio air like a knife. Lester Trump interrupted almost immediately. "Before we get into whatever you've got planned here, let me just say, I know what this is. I've been doing this long enough to know when someone's got an agenda, so why don't we just cut to the chase? What is it you really want to ask me?" Holt didn't flinch. He'd expected this, the attempt to seize control of the narrative before it even began. He placed his papers down on the desk between them and leaned forward slightly, his eyes never leaving Trump's face. "Mr. President," Holt began, and there was something in the way he said those two words that made it clear this wasn't going to be a friendly conversation. "I want to talk about credibility. Specifically, I want to talk about statements you've made over the past several months that have been demonstrably proven false. Not opinions, not political spin, but verifiable facts that contradict what you've told the American people. How do you explain that?" Trump's expression shifted. The casual confidence that had been there moments before tightened into something harder. His hands, which had been resting calmly, now gripped the armrests. "Demonstrably proven false," Trump repeated, his voice rising slightly. "By who? Lester. By the same media that's been trying to take me down since day one. By the same people who said I'd never win, who said everything I did was wrong, who twisted every single word I've ever said. You're talking about credibility, but let's talk about the credibility of the people doing the so-called fact-checking." Holt was ready for this too. He reached for a specific document from his stack, one he'd marked with multiple tabs and highlights. This wasn't conjecture or hearsay. This was documented record, and he was prepared to walk through it line by line if necessary. "I'm not talking about opinion pieces or editorial commentary," Holt responded, his voice remaining level despite Trump's escalating tone. "I'm talking about statements you made on record. Statements that have been contradicted by your own administration officials, by documentation, by video evidence. For example, 3 months ago you claimed that you had never been briefed on a specific intelligence matter. We have testimony from 4 separate officials who were in the room during that briefing. We have the briefing documents themselves with your signature on the acknowledgement page. How do you explain that discrepancy?" The word discrepancy hung in the air like an accusation, which of course it was. Trump's face flushed red, and for a moment he said nothing. The silence stretched out, uncomfortable and heavy, filled only by the soft hum of the studio equipment. When he finally spoke, his voice had changed entirely. Gone was the playful deflection, replaced by something much more raw. You know what, Lester? This is exactly what I'm talking about. You sit there with your papers and your supposed evidence, and you think you've got me cornered. But what you don't understand is context. You don't understand that in the moment I made that statement, I was referring to a specific briefing, not the general topic. You media people, you love to take things out of context, to make it seem like someone's lying, when really you're just not smart enough to understand the nuance. Holt didn't let the insult land. He'd been called worse, and he knew that getting emotional would only derail what he was trying to accomplish. Instead, he pressed forward, pulling out another document. "Then, let's talk about context," he said calmly. "Here's the transcript of the press conference where you made that statement. I'll read your exact words. You said, and I quote, 'I have never, not once, been briefed on this matter.' Those were your words, not taken out of context, not edited, not spun, your own words. And yet we have documented proof that you were briefed, not once, but 3 times. So I'll ask again, how do you explain that?" Trump leaned forward now, his finger pointing across the desk at Holt. The transformation was complete, from relaxed interviewee to combative opponent. This wasn't an interview anymore, this was a confrontation. "You want to know how I explain it? I'll tell you exactly how I explain it. Sometimes when you're dealing with hundreds of briefings, thousands of pieces of information coming at you every single day, you might not remember one specific meeting. Does that make me a liar? Or does that make me human? But of course, you don't want to hear that. You want your gotcha moment? You want to be able to run this on your network and say, 'Look, we caught Trump in a lie.' Well, congratulations, Lester. You got what you wanted." But Holt wasn't done. If anything, Trump's response had only reinforced his determination to push through to the truth. He understood that this was the critical moment, the point where he could either back down and let the interview dissolve into talking points and deflection, or he could hold firm and continue demanding accountability. "This isn't about gotcha journalism," Holt said, and his voice had taken on a harder edge now. "This is about the American people deserving honest answers from their leaders. And when there's a pattern, not just one instance, but multiple documented cases where your statements don't align with the facts, that's not a memory issue, that's a credibility issue. And that, Mr. President, is what we need to address." The words hung between them like a challenge thrown down in the center of a ring. Trump's eyes narrowed, and for several long seconds, the two men simply stared at each other across the desk. The camera operators, the producers, everyone in the studio seemed to be holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. "A credibility issue," Trump finally said, his voice low and dangerous. "You want to talk about credibility issues, Lester? Let's talk about your network. Let's talk about the stories you've run that turned out to be completely false. Let's talk about the anonymous sources that never existed, the bombshell reports that fizzled into nothing. Where's the accountability there? Where's your credibility when you get it wrong?" Holt met his gaze without wavering. "When we get something wrong, we issue corrections. We acknowledge our mistakes. We hold ourselves accountable. That's what journalistic integrity looks like. What I'm asking is whether you're willing to do the same thing. Are you willing to acknowledge when you've made false statements? Are you willing to correct the record?" The question landed like a punch, direct and unavoidable. Trump shifted in his seat, and those watching could see the war playing out behind his eyes. He was calculating, weighing his options, trying to figure out how to escape this corner without admitting fault. "You know what your problem is, Lester?" Trump said finally. "Your problem is that you think you're some kind of moral authority. You think because you sit in that chair and read off a teleprompter, that makes you better than everyone else. But I'll tell you something. The American people, they see through this. They see what you're trying to do here, and they don't like it. They didn't elect you to anything. They elected me." And that's exactly the deflection I'm talking about. Holt responded immediately, not giving Trump even a moment to build momentum on that line of attack. "This isn't about me, and it's not about the election. This is about accountability for statements made to the public. You keep trying to make this about the media, about my network, about anything other than the central question I'm asking you. So let me be crystal clear. Do you stand by the statements you made, or do you acknowledge they were inaccurate?" Trump's face had gone from red to almost purple now. His hands were no longer just gripping the armrests. They were practically white-knuckled. When he spoke again, his voice had risen to a level that made the sound technicians in the booth wince and adjust their levels. "I stand by everything I've ever said," Trump declared, jabbing his finger toward Holt with each word. Everything. Because unlike you and your friends in the media, I don't parse my words through 10 lawyers and a focus group before I speak. I tell the truth as I see it, and if that bothers you, if that doesn't fit into your neat little narrative, then that's your problem, not mine. The American people elected me because they were sick of politicians who measure every word, who say nothing with 1,000 words. They wanted someone real, and that's what they got. Holt leaned back slightly, processing this. He'd interviewed dozens of world leaders, countless politicians, and he'd developed a sense for when someone was genuinely convinced of their own righteousness versus when they were simply performing. With Trump, it was always difficult to tell where the performance ended and the genuine belief began. But it didn't matter, not really. The facts were the facts, regardless of how passionately someone believed their own version of events. Being real and being accurate aren't mutually exclusive, Holt said carefully. The American people deserve both authenticity and truth. And when someone in a position of power makes false statements, intentionally or not, it has consequences. It affects policy decisions. It affects public trust. It affects the democratic process itself. So whether you want to call it a lie, a misstatement, a memory lapse, whatever term you're comfortable with, the question remains, what are you going to do about it? What am I going to do about it? Trump repeated, and there was something almost incredulous in his tone, as if the question itself was offensive. I'm going to keep doing exactly what I've been doing. I'm going to keep fighting for the American people. I'm going to keep calling out the fake news media when they try to twist my words. And I'm going to keep winning, despite every obstacle you people put in my way. That's what I'm going to do about it. Holt pulled out another document, this one thicker than the previous ones. The gesture was deliberate, a visual reminder that he had more ammunition, that this line of questioning wasn't going to simply disappear because Trump raised his voice or changed the subject. Let's talk about another specific example then, Holt said, flipping through the pages. 2 months ago, you claimed that a particular policy decision would save taxpayers billions of dollars. The Congressional Budget Office released their analysis last week showing that the policy will actually increase spending by substantial margins. Your own party members have questioned the math behind your claims. When confronted with the CBO report, you called it fake news. But these are nonpartisan analysts, career professionals who've served under multiple administrations. Why should the public believe your numbers over theirs? Trump waved his hand dismissively, a gesture that somehow managed to convey both frustration and contempt. The CBO, he said, his voice dripping with disdain. You mean the same CBO that's been wrong about practically every major economic prediction for the last 20 years? The same CBO that said my tax plan would tank the economy, and then the economy boomed. Those experts. Lester, here's what you don't understand. I've built businesses. I've created jobs. I've actually done things in the real world, not just pushed papers around in some government office. So when I look at numbers, I see things these so-called experts miss. But we're not talking about predictions, Holt countered, his patience clearly wearing thin. We're talking about basic mathematics. The policy costs what it costs. The revenue comes in at a certain level. These aren't opinions or forecasts. These are calculations based on the actual structure of the policy you proposed. Are you saying the CBO literally did the math wrong? Trump spread his hands wide in a gesture that seemed designed to suggest Holt was missing something obvious. I'm saying their math doesn't account for growth. It doesn't account for innovation. It doesn't account for all the ways that good policy creates opportunities that don't show up in their little spreadsheets. This is the problem with people like you, Lester. You want everything to fit into a neat box, to be quantifiable and predictable. But that's not how the real world works. Holt set the document down with enough force that the sound was audible in the microphones. For the first time since the interview began, his professional composure showed visible cracks. His voice remained controlled, but there was an intensity in his eyes that hadn't been there before. With all due respect, Mr. President, that's not an answer. You can't just dismiss objective analysis because you don't like the conclusions. If your policy is going to cost more than you claimed, the American people have a right to know that before it's implemented. Saying it'll all work out because of growth and innovation isn't a fiscal policy, it's magical thinking. Magical thinking, Trump repeated slowly, and his voice had dropped to a dangerous quiet. You just called my economic policy magical thinking on national television. You know what, Lester? This is exactly why the American people don't trust the media anymore. Because you've appointed yourselves as the arbiters of truth, the the final judges of what's real and what's not. But you're not. You're just another guy with a TV show, and your opinion doesn't matter any more than anyone else's. It's not my opinion, Holt shot back, and now his voice had risen to match Trump's earlier volume. It's the analysis of independent experts. It's documented evidence. It's verifiable facts. And the reason I keep pressing you on this is because every time you're confronted with information that contradicts your narrative, you attack the source instead of addressing the substance. You did it with the intelligence briefing. You're doing it with the CBO report. That's not leadership. That's evasion. The word evasion seemed to hit Trump like a physical blow. He stood up abruptly from his chair, and for a moment, it seemed like he might actually walk out of the interview entirely. The producers in the control room tensed, ready to cut to commercial if things completely fell apart. But Trump didn't leave. Instead, he turned back to face Holt, and when he spoke again, his voice was shaking with barely controlled rage. You want to talk about evasion, Lester? Let's talk about how your network sat on stories that could have changed elections. Let's talk about how you buried information that didn't fit your preferred narrative. You stand there and lecture me about facts and evidence, but you've been playing games with the truth for years. The only difference is you've gotten away with it because you control the platform. Holt remained seated, which somehow made him seem more in control than Trump standing above him. You can attack me. You can attack my network. You can attack the entire media establishment if you want. But, at the end of the day, those questions are still sitting there, unanswered. The statements you made are still contradicted by the evidence, and no amount of outrage or deflection changes that fundamental reality. Trump slowly sat back down, but his posture had completely changed. He was leaning forward now, aggressive, confrontational. The casual confidence from the beginning of the interview was long gone, replaced by something rawer and more dangerous. You want reality, Lester? Here's reality. I've accomplished more in my time in office than politicians who've been in Washington for 40 years. I've changed things. I've fought for people who'd been forgotten. And every single day, people like you try to tear it down. You pick apart every word. You analyze every statement. You look for any tiny inconsistency you can blow up into a scandal. And you know why? Because you can't stand that someone like me, someone who didn't come up through your approved channels, has been successful despite all your efforts to stop me. The silence that followed Trump's last statement hung in the air like smoke after an explosion. In the control room, the executive producer was making frantic hand signals to keep rolling, sensing that they were either about to capture television history or witness a complete meltdown. Either way, it was compelling viewing. Holt took a measured breath, visibly collecting himself. When he spoke again, his voice had returned to that measured, almost clinical tone that had defined his career. Mr. President, I think we've established that we have fundamentally different views on accountability and truth-telling. But let me ask you something more personal, because I think the American people deserve to understand this. He paused, making sure he had Trump's full attention. When you make a statement that turns out to be incorrect, and you later learn it was incorrect, do you ever feel any obligation to correct the record? Not for the media, not for your critics, but for the people who believed you and made decisions based on what you said. Trump's jaw worked silently for a moment, as if he was physically chewing on the question. His eyes had narrowed to slits, and the redness in his face had somehow deepened even further. You're trying to trap me, Trump said finally, his voice low and accusatory. You're trying to get me to admit I was wrong about something, anything, so you can run that clip for the next 6 months. I know how this works, Lester. I've been dealing with people like you my entire life. I'm asking you a straightforward question about integrity, Holt replied, and there was something almost sad in his tone now, as if he'd given up hope of getting a real answer. It's not a trap. It's actually an opportunity for you to demonstrate the kind of leadership that transcends politics. Every president makes mistakes, misremembers things, gets bad information. The question is what they do when they realize it. I don't make mistakes, Trump said, and the absoluteness of the statement seemed to surprise even him. He quickly added, or when I do, they're insignificant compared to what I've accomplished. You want me to spend my time issuing corrections and apologies while the country needs leadership? That's not how winners operate, Lester. Holt closed the folder in front of him with deliberate finality. The gesture seemed to signal something not surrender, but perhaps a recognition that they'd reached the limits of productive conversation. I think that statement, right there, might be the most honest thing you've said in this entire interview, Holt observed. And I think it explains a lot about why we're having such difficulty communicating. Because from where I sit, the willingness to acknowledge error, to correct course when presented with new information, that's not weakness, that's wisdom. Trump leaned back in his chair, and for the first time in several minutes, something like a smile crossed his face. But it wasn't a pleasant smile, it was the expression of someone who decided they'd had enough of playing nice. You know what your problem is, Lester? You think you're better than me? You and all your media friends. You think because you went to the right schools, and you use the right words, and you know how to look serious on camera, that makes you superior. But you're not. You're just better at hiding your biases behind a mask of objectivity. At least I'm honest about who I am and what I believe. If you truly believe that standing by false statements rather than correcting them is honesty, Holt said quietly, then we're operating with completely different definitions of that word. The interview continued for another 15 minutes. But the dynamic had fundamentally shifted. Trump had retreated into a defensive crouch, deflecting every question with attacks on the media, references to his accomplishments, and increasingly personal jabs at Holt himself. For his part, Holt had abandoned any hope of getting substantive answers. Instead, simply documenting Trump's refusal to engage with the evidence he'd presented. When it finally ended, Trump pulled off his microphone without waiting for the sound technician and walked off the set. Without shaking Holt's hand, a breach of protocol that would itself become a news story, Holt sat alone at the desk for a moment, staring at the stack of documents he'd prepared. Knowing that he'd used less than half of them in the control room, the executive producer was already on the phone with the network president. We're going to need to add time to the evening broadcast, she was saying. This is going to be everywhere by tonight. She was right. Within an hour, clips from the interview were trending on every social media platform. By evening, cable news channels were running the confrontation on loop, with panels of experts dissecting every exchange, every facial expression, every word choice. Political operatives from both parties were already spinning the narrative to their advantage. But perhaps the most telling moment came 3 hours after the interview ended. When Trump posted on social media, "Lester Holt is a third-rate reporter who tried to ambush me with fake news and failed miserably. I destroyed him. Everyone is saying it was one of my best interviews ever. The American people see through these media games." Holt, asked by a colleague how he felt about the post, simply shrugged. "The interview speaks for itself," he said. "People can watch it and make up their own minds about what happened." And that, perhaps, was the fundamental divide that the interview had exposed, not just between Trump and Holt, not just between a president and a journalist, but between two incompatible views of reality itself. One, where objective truth existed and mattered, and another where reality was whatever you could convince people to believe. The question of which view would ultimately prevail remained, as it always had, unanswered asterisk. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more political drama, character-driven confrontations, and explorations of truth in the modern media landscape, don't forget to subscribe to stay updated on new content like this story if it resonated with you. Share it with friends who appreciate compelling dialogue and timely themes. And leave a comment below with your thoughts. I'd love to hear your perspective on this exchange.